With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Your kids could get free or low-cost health coverage from Medicaid or CHIP. Even if you've applied before, they may be eligible now. Kids up to age 19 are covered for checkups, vaccines, dentist visits, hospital care, and more. And if they already have Medicaid or CHIP, remember to renew every year. Visit insurekidsnow.gov or call 877-KIDS-NOW. Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Howdy, folks. We're returning to our journey with John now to get more revelations of the apocalypse. In this episode, we're going to get to see angels actually do some work. And if you're familiar with the Bible, you know that when angels start getting busy, some very terrible things tend to happen. It's best when angels are just watching and reporting on things. When they take action, that's when cities get leveled, and the firstborn child of every family in the region will end up dead. That's precisely what happened in Exodus. And so we're going to get more stuff being thrown down to earth from the heavens. And this time, one of these objects is going to be given a name. Just like one of the riders of the 4 horses in the last volume. And this object's name is absinthos, which we know as absinthe, a strange green beverage. It's a pale green beverage, actually. You might describe it as chloros. Anyway, whatever this material is, it makes water undrinkable. It makes people sick. But it came out of the sky. And we'll talk about that in this volume. We'll get that all straightened out. I promise you by the end of this volume, you'll 100% understand everything in this book, and you'll know exactly what it means. And of course, I'm lying. That's never going to be the case, unfortunately. But as we move into this episode, and we go into the first passage, you'll see that it looks like we've done a little bit of a rewind. We've gone back in time a little bit between the passages that we ended with in Volume 3, because now in Volume 4, we're seeing preparations in God's throne room. It really seems like things are ready to jump off, but they haven't quite done that yet. So I get the impression that this is before the asteroid strike that John saw the vision of in the last episode. And that's kind of weird. Why do I think that? Well, like I said in the last volume, the book circles back to events. And so we're going to see more of the same asteroid strike. At least I think so. Because when you line things up logically, you're not going to have a whole lot of people left if we have 4 independent asteroid strikes. I noticed that John is always talking about a fraction of the people who die, a fraction of the ships are destroyed, or a fraction of the trees are burned, meaning not all of it. And another reason I think we've rewound the tape a little bit is because we're seeing the angels getting ready. They're getting trumpets ready. They're restraining the winds. And they've been given a mission to stamp believers with seals, the same word as before, sfragida, this time on their foreheads. And this will give them some sort of protection for when things really get bad. And so, speaking of things getting real bad, let's move on with the revelation to John. And let's see what's happening in this next passage, where it seems that God's throne room personnel are getting ready for some big event.
After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. They restrained the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind blew over the land or over the sea, nor touched even a single tree. I saw another angel ascending from the east, bearing the seal of the living God. And he spoke with a loud voice to the 4 angels, who had authority to harm the land and the sea, saying, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we have stamped a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God." And I heard how many received the seal. 144,000 were sealed from every tribe of Israel.
And so now I think you see my point. We see one of the lead angels speaking to the other 4 angels, telling them don't harm anything until we've stamped a seal on certain people's foreheads. And so this tells me that this is before anything really, really awful has happened. Like I said, the book is not linear. It's cyclical. It comes back to some of the same information. Or, another way of looking at it, as some people have, is that we are looking at different sets of historical events. In other words, yes, some of this applies to the fall of the Roman Empire, but some of this might apply to our future. And so, the 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, and it's interesting because epi tas tesaras gonias tes geis. Gonias is corners. Now, you might hear that gon sound and recognize the G-O-N from words like hexagon or pentagon. We get our word for a 4-cornered object from Latin, rectangle, meaning a squared off angled thing. It really means a set of right angles. But in Greek, it would be tessaragonia, or a tessaragon. So the image literally is an image of these angled corners or points at the edge of the earth. Now, John, being a reasonably educated person from the time, would have known that the earth is a sphere. John is not a flat earther writing about his vision of the world. In the 1st century AD, the Greco-Roman world was fully in understanding that the earth was a sphere. And like we covered in a previous volume in my discussion with the various Johns, they did understand about how big the earth was. Their estimation of the circumference wasn't off by much. Their big misunderstanding was that they didn't know about the 2 gigantic continents between Spain and India. And so these angels restrained the 4 winds of the earth. John is clearly referring to common idioms to talk about global events. Those idioms, of course, still thought of the earth as flat. That was the primary belief during the Bronze Age. It was Greco-Roman geometers in the Hellenistic period, in the 300s BC, almost 400 years before our author here, John. And these Greek researchers took careful measurements and worked out that the earth had to be spherical, based on measuring angles of the sun at certain times and measuring distances between cities, which was extremely difficult to do at the time. But you can look up Eratosthenes, Eratosthenes. He's the first guy on record that we know of to prove geometrically, based on observation, that the earth must be a sphere. So, when we say that these angels mastered the wind, these angels are kratuntas tus tesaras anelus. The image here is like someone taming a horse or damming a river. I used the word restrained, but it's more like overmastered or tamed. But I felt like that was a little too poetic. For example, the name Hippocrates. That first part might sound familiar after last week where I talked about hippos, meaning horse in Greek. So Hippocrates, Hippocrates, what could that mean? Well, it means horse tamer, horse master, person who tames horses. Now that krat sound, which we represent in our letters as C-R-A-T, might also be familiar. And it's related to English words like autocrat or democracy. Demokratia is mastery by the lower classes. Or you could say being tamed or conquered by the rabble, the great unwashed illiterate masses. That's what demos means. Demos would mean the opposite of the aristocracy. So the aristoi were the best people, the highest born people. So aristokratia would be ruled by the best people. Aristocracy. Demokratia in the ancient world was regarded as the opposite. It was ruled by the not-so-great people. And so just know that democracy in the modern world was heralded as a great noble virtue, something we should all be working toward. But just know that in the pre-modern world, where they saw democracy, they didn't like it, for the most part. The faction that established the pure democracy in Athens were a quite violent and rather disorganized and determined people, and their government didn't last even 100 years. So, democracy didn't have a good record. Now, about these seals. These are the same kinds of seals that were on the scroll. These are sphragidas. And there are 144,000 of them. And they need to be stamped on the servant's forehead. It's very explicit. It says, epiton metopon. That's your forehead. Really, the space over your face. And so the image here is of hot wax being dripped onto someone's forehead and then the seal being applied. And I do think that that's probably metaphorical. Just like the other image of the scroll with the seals is entirely metaphorical. I don't think John is saying that God really operates that way. But the image is given to him to help him understand the planning and the intent behind what's happening. Now, who are these 144,000 people? John lists every tribe of Israel after this, and he says that 12,000 are sealed from each tribe. And so that's where we get the 144,000 total. Now, what does this mean? So only people descended from the tribes of Israel were sealed, and everyone else is just sort of out of luck? Isn't this a Christian document? Do any non-Jewish Christians get that seal? By 95 AD, the majority of Christians did not have ethnic Jewish ancestry. They would be regarded as, Phoenicians or Egyptians or Greeks, and beginning more and more, you are starting to have Romans converting, actual Latin-speaking people converting to Christianity. An insane thought. But it was starting to happen. And so this seems to be a reference to God still protecting the Jews as his chosen people. And so notice it's not everybody who's a Jew. It's Jews who are regarded as servants. And there were certainly more than 144,000 Jews in the world in 95 AD. And so this is indicating that only a few are going to be stamped. As I said earlier, by 95 AD, the majority of believers in Christ were not Jews ethnically. And so a Christian reading this will immediately know that there's another plan for Christians, that this is God arranging to preserve some remnant of the Israelites through the great suffering that's about to happen. And now John tells us about something that's going on in the throne room. And let's hear about that.
Then I looked, and I saw a huge crowd, more than anyone could count, from every race, tribe, people, and language. They were standing before the throne and before the Lamb, all dressed in white robes, with palm fronds in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation to our God who sits on the throne, and salvation to the Lamb." All the angels surrounded the throne, and the elders and the four creatures. The angels fell down on their faces before the throne, and they worshipped God, saying, "Praise, glory, wisdom, gratitude, honor, power, and strength to our God, forever and ever. Amen."
What I'm starting to notice is that John sees God the Father, at least, if not the entire Godhead, but at least that one element of God as the one who sits on the throne. He sees that authority in a very earthly sense. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, God is represented here as a person sitting on a throne. If we think back to how Moses saw God, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this volume, but Moses didn't see this being that looked like they were carved out of stone sitting on a throne. That's very Greco-Roman. That's a little idolatrous. Moses saw just a flame, a fire in a bush, but the bush was not being consumed by the flame. So in other words, it was warmth and light. God didn't appear in any kind of humanoid form. And God did ask Moses to take his sandals off because he was in a holy place. And that's interesting. There's a different protocol being followed here, and you can see that it's a more Greco-Roman one, or at least it's his concept of what a throne room is like. It's not a mountain with a dirt floor, and people simply take their dirty sandals off before they approach a great flame. And also notice that in the Old Testament, and especially in Moses' case, these guys talk back to God. They'll argue with God. They're not frozen in fear with their foreheads touching the ground. So we see a development here. God the Father is very detached, very mechanical. There's no heart-to-heart discussions. I suppose the time for that is over at this point. John's conception of God is like an earthly ruler of his time, including elders attending to him. And that's kind of strange to me. Attendants are not something that an eternal, perfect, omnipotent being would need or want. They're already everywhere. They can do everything just by thinking. And even more than that, these humans in the court are praising and honoring God. But that's something that's necessary for human leadership. With human leadership, you do have to have the followers express these emotions of something similar to praise, something similar to acknowledging wisdom, something similar to gratitude for previous grace being given. and acknowledgement of their power and strength, that sort of thing. And when human leaders start seeing expressions of the opposite from the people that supposedly follow them, they become alarmed. Now, when you're an omnipotent being that knows everything, and especially if you're an omnipotent being who's omniscient, who knows everything, and also respects free will, where you're not going to reach in and grab someone by the throat and force them to think a certain way. That's not something that we see God doing in the biblical sources, with perhaps a couple of exceptions in the Old Testament, but we'll talk about that later. In other words, this apparatus of worship and service and liturgy seems to be something designed to ensure that John understands that God is in charge of this operation. It's almost more for John's consumption. It's for him to understand who is directing this scene. And we continue to see this human ruler model, especially an Eastern-style human ruler, when John has people and even angels falling down on their faces before God's throne. And this falling down on your face is the proskune, which is what we talked about in previous volumes. And so here I think John is relaying imagery that underlines the fact that the being that he worships as God the Father is the one who has calculated this plan. I think intention is part of why we're getting these blocks of imagery related to the worship that's going on inside God's throne room. And you know, I've been wondering, who are these people in the white robes? Where did they come from? Let's hear more about that.
Then one of the elders asked me, "Who are these people in the white robes? Where did they come from?" I said to him, "You know, my lord." And he said to me, "These are the ones from the great suffering. They washed their robes and made them white with the blood of the Lamb."
So that was a strange exchange. It's strange that the elder would ask John who the people are. And then it's strange for John to know that the elder knew who they were. That's strange. And then when John reminded him, the elder suddenly remembers and then tells John who they are. The Greek doesn't clear this up. It's interesting when John says, "You know, my lord," the word for lord that he's using is kurios, which is what we had used earlier when we were talking about what the beings in the throne room were chanting. This is less formal. He says kuriemu. That mu at the end is a form of my. And so the way he's saying my lord is kind of like my lord. It's more an example of courtly politeness than actually talking about this person's authority. John is just being civil and addressing a church elder the way you would address a church elder in his time. And then the elder refers to the great suffering. He says, these are the ones from the great suffering. Klipsios tes megales. And that first word again is thlipsis. You would transliterate that THLIPSIS. So say that 5 times real fast. Thlipsis. And remember the TH referred to a kind of soft or airy kind of T that the Romans recognized was different from their standard T. And so they added an H to let readers know, no, we're talking about the Greek T. Now, the problem there is that later on in the Middle Ages, you have this Germanic sound that we love so much in English that we write with TH, and it's the or the, that, this. That's the TH that is one of our favorite sounds, but it's a very Germanic and Northern European sound. It doesn't exist much in the Mediterranean. In the modern period, when we had to absorb that sound into our arsenal of letters, they went ahead and used the old formulation of adding an H after the T to represent both the Germanic th sound and the Old Greek soft t sound, thus adding one more confusion to the confused pile of grammatical ideas that we call English. And this thlipsis could be translated as suffering, but also tribulation, torture, test, trial, or affliction. So these are the people from the great torture, from the great trial, the great affliction. The elder tells John that these people washed their robes and made them white with the blood of the Lamb. And of course, that's designed to sound contradictory and ironic. It's designed to represent the redeeming quality of Christ's sacrifice. I wanted to say they bleached their robes with the blood of the Lamb. That would sound cool. Bleached in the blood. And that's tempting because they do use the word washed, eplunan, tas tolas. They washed their robes. But then they added, kai eleokanan autas. And that means they whitened them. They made them white. This leokos was used to describe the first horse that came out when the first seal was broken. They said it was a rider on a white horse. They used leokos. And here, the same word is being turned into a verb, and they whitened their robes using the blood of the Lamb. In the next clip, we're going to hear another strange statement. And as usual, when something strange comes up, it's probably a mystery or cultural artifact that was handed down from the Bronze Age collapse. We're going to do a whole episode on the Bronze Age collapse. In a nutshell, Mediterranean civilization fell apart around 1200 BC, meaning it seems like all of the powers dissolved. You had roaming bands of marauders rather than actual armies. Cities weren't being built. Rather, we find cities being burned. People weren't writing things down. And when the lights came back on, so to speak, in 800 BC, which is what we call the beginning of the classical period, you ended up with brand new ethnicities, and then ethnicities and civilizations that were huge and powerful and prosperous before 1200 BC were suddenly gone, or a shell of their former self. Egypt is a good example. What we call Egypt before the Bronze Age collapse, before 1200 BC, and what we call Egypt after 1200 BC are quite different. Before 1200 BC, the Middle East and the Mediterranean were ruled by cultures that we know, like Egypt, Sumeria, the Minoans. They were centered on Crete in the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans, if you've heard of Achilles or Odysseus, that's what they were. And the Etruscans, they ruled over the Romans. Now, some of those names are familiar, some are kind of not familiar, and it's all because they're all clouded in mystery. They're all related to later civilizations. Obviously, one fragment of the Mycenaeans eventually developed into what we would call the Greeks, but the story is complicated. In general, we have 400 years of history that's more or less missing. It's all chaos and a gigantic pile of little clues as to what happened, but the real deal is always shrouded in mystery. And so the Exodus occurred right around 1200 BC. And this was Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And this journey did not go smoothly. And during their 30 years of wandering in the desert, mostly in Sinai and then farther north into what we would now call Palestine or Israel, during this time, their relationship with their new religion was developing, and there were certain habits that they took on during these 30 years that created ideas and terminology that lasted and were handed down even to John in his time over 1,000 years later. So let's see what he's talking about next.
This is why they are here before the throne of God. They serve him day and night in his sanctuary. And the one who sits on the throne will raise his holy tent over them.
Okay, he will raise a holy tent over them. And that is my translation of a Greek verb, skenose. The one who sits on the throne is gonna skenose with them. Well, skene in Greek means a tent. It's a cloth and some poles. It's a wooden frame you throw something over to sleep in when you're traveling. And so you could almost say that the one who sits on the throne will tent with them. He'll camp out with them. One word for tent in Latin is tabernaculum. It's where we get the word tabernacle from. Now, of course, the way we use tabernacle is not quite the sense of a tent, but forms of that word have sprung up all over the place. We talk about taverns, and that comes from the Latin taberna, which means a shop or a stall or a booth, a little thing that a vendor throws up, kind of like a table with a cover over it. So remember that a tabernaculum is like a little stall, a little booth, a tent. And as I mentioned before, one of the main differences between the Israelites and the other people around them is that they refused to build idols. They had forbidden physical representations of their God in their culture or their worship. And this is a huge difference, because it doesn't take long to figure out that pretty much every other culture was obsessed with building expensive and huge physical representations of their gods. But when Moses saw God, he didn't see a person at all. There was no throne. As I said, it was a flame in a burning bit of foliage, and the foliage was not being burned by the flame. So God was essentially light. And Yahweh specifically said, don't create idols. Don't create physical representations of me. Now, famously, you had Israelites who slipped up and definitely made idols, but they all understood in general that the idea was that that's not something that they did. And so what do? How do you transition into worshiping a new God that doesn't want idols? And not only that, if you wanted an idol, what were you going to do? You are a nomad. You're living in your own tents in the desert, wandering for 30 years. And I think it's interesting that apparently they gave God his own tent, his own tabernaculum, in a special place in their camp. And so wherever they went, they would set up a special tent inside a special roped-off zone that was guarded, but there were definitely no idols of any kind. Another thing that's interesting, I think, is that when you look at the houses of nobles and kings and rulers from the Bronze Age, when you excavate the house of a wealthy ruler who lived in the Mediterranean before 1200 BC, it's interesting that the temples built by that culture after the lights come back on, after 800 BC, those temples tend to look like the houses of the old rulers. So in other words, I said that a branch of the Mycenaeans would evolve into what we call Greek culture now. And what do you know? If you go and look at excavations of Mycenaean rulers, for example, the kind of house that Agamemnon might have lived in, when we look at those houses, they're basically wooden and plaster versions of temples. The temples we see made out of limestone and marble 1,000 years later. Agamemnon's house would have had a nice prism-shaped roof. It would have been rectangular, long. It had wooden columns lining all around the sides and the front. where there was some stairs and some big doors, and it was really cool and rectangular and pretty. And what do you know? Gigantic stone, highly decorated versions of that same layout became the idea for where you would have gods live among you in a Greek city. So, the Parthenon, for example, is a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin Born, meaning she was spawned out of Zeus's head asexually. She did not have a childhood. And so, in her temple, it's a long rectangular structure, prism-shaped roof, lined with columns all around the sides, with a gigantic statue of Athena inside, because that's really what the temples were. They were the houses of the gods. They served the same purpose as the tabernaculum or the skene that the Israelites carried with them, except for them, Yahweh couldn't be represented in stone. So I was curious to see what the King James did with this issue of having to translate skenose like that. Are they going to say that he's going to set up a tent among them? What are they going to choose? Let's hear.
Therefore are they before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them.
So I think this was clever. This was an example of the King James translators trying to collapse a gigantic cultural gap between their readers of the early modern period in England and this 3,000-year-old Israelite tradition. What they did was they just jumped directly to the real meaning behind setting up the tabernacle, which is to show God living with his people. It was proximity, familiarity of God. That's what it represented. And so I had mentioned that in the old days of the Exodus, when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, God's tent was placed inside a sanctuary that was guarded, and it was considered a holy place, just like the area around the burning bush. Now, the difference here is that these church elders in John's account here are essentially living inside that special zone. They're inside the holy zone, and that's where they are with God all the time. And so this is what the King James is getting at. Essentially, only a priest was allowed inside the tent. And since these church elders are with God all the time in the throne room, they are essentially priests. They're seen as having the same rank as Moses' son Aaron and the priests that followed him. But now, these people that God is setting up his tent with, that God is camping with, these are people who have suffered because of their beliefs. And so now John is going to tell us their ultimate fate and the hope that they represent for the rest of us.
They will never again feel hunger or thirst. They will never again feel the burning heat of the sun raining down on them. Because the Lamb in the middle of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to living springs of water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes.
I know that this is supposed to be comforting, but if someone says, "You'll never feel the heat of the sun again," that doesn't sound too great. I mean, sometimes that's exactly the feeling you want, right? It's part of why people go to the beach. But note that in the Greek, once again, it's being more specific than English. It's using a word, kaoma, which refers to a painful heat. So you'll never be burned by the sun again. The implication is that they will still feel warmth and light from the sun. It just won't be extreme or painful. This is a small indicator of how ancient people had a slightly different relationship to the sun than we do. On one hand, they understood their dependence on it more than we do. almost all of the energy on Earth is secondary solar power. Geothermal energy doesn't come from the sun. Nuclear energy doesn't come from the sun. But all the energy that's bound up in sugar ultimately came from photosynthesis, which uses solar energy to create complex molecules like sugar. C6H12O6. That's not simple. And fossil fuels are also secondary solar. The reason they're called fossil fuels is because that black goop or those oily rocks that we're seeing are actually the fossils of old plants from the Carboniferous period that died in an era before microorganisms had evolved any enzymes to break down cellulose. We had entire forests that would die, and the wood would just sit there and eventually be buried under sediment and eventually converted into petroleum. And so if you're wondering, are we making any more petroleum now? If we sit around for a couple of million years and then start looking around the Earth, will we find that Earth has generated more fossil fuels? Unfortunately, no. As soon as natural selection picked the lock and a microorganism evolved an enzyme that could break down cellulose, then the game was over, because that means that wood would then rot. When trees die, the cellulose in the wood is broken back down and reused by the biosphere. And so that energy isn't locked away under the ground for some industrious human to drill down to millions of years later. So ancient people understood how they depended on the sun for energy more. At the same time, they also understood that the sun was the cause of a lot of suffering. As far as we can tell, they had no idea that sunlight could kill you through cancer. But they were fully aware that the sun beating down on you can cause heat stroke or burn your skin. Moving on to the lamb being their shepherd. Now, the King James uses the phrase, feed them. The lamb will feed them. A lot of modern translations use be their shepherd, like I did, because that is the best translation of the verb being used here. You could generalize it a bit and use a word like guide or tend to them. Feeding is a little bit overboard because there's no specific transfer of food described by this verb. In fact, it's more that they're being led toward a goal rather than being fed like helpless children. And I can't help but think that John is intending more ironic imagery here involving the lamb. In other words, here we have a lamb being a shepherd, which I think is an interesting play on words, a sort of contradictory, ironic image. And of course, this all is part of Jesus being seen as a servant leader. When you look in the Gospels, you'll see that there are these reversals of roles of the power structure in the universe all the time surrounding Jesus, where God is the servant, where the lamb is the shepherd. This shepherd is leading people to living springs of water. My translation sounds a little awkward there. Living springs of water. What does that mean? Well, I'm doing that deliberately because the phrasing sounds awkward and a little confusing in Greek. King James has, and shall lead them unto living fountains of waters. Another modern translation has, and will guide them to springs of the water of life. I think King James wins here. Sounds better. But I think that we have to keep the living part, or the part that talks about it being of life, away from the water part, because the Greek keeps them separate. So it's clear that the springs are alive, not the water. They are living springs, or springs of life, and then water is added on afterward. Now, using water in the plural, as he's doing here, could mean deep water or multiple bodies of water. And also note that the spring, when we talk about a spring where water comes out of the ground, like Barton Springs here in Austin, the word spring really refers to the land area around where the water is coming out of the ground. And the greenery that forms there and makes it a special place because it's so dry and barren everywhere else. And so when John talks about the living springs of water, I think he's talking about the locations, the places on the earth where this water comes out of the ground. In other words, an oasis. So John is saying that he will lead them to oases in the middle of these dry, barren places. And then, of course, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. This is a very calming image for a group of people who are being persecuted and terrorized. It's almost like John is taking a moment here to give us a peaceful image, a comforting image before we move on to chapter 8. And that is where we're going to break the 7th seal. And so far, as I've said before, this is kind of the calm before the storm. Before we move on, we have to talk a little bit about censors. Not really censors, but censors. Not censors, as in the kind of people that keep telling me to stop saying the N-word so much, or the C-word, and I'm constantly having to go back and delete like 10 minutes out of every episode to get rid of all the profanity and the sex talk. You know, it's just the way I normally think, and I'm obsessed with it, and I want to share it with everybody else, whether they want to hear it or not, and people have a problem with that, and I don't get it. But I guess I'll keep on censoring myself and sticking to subjects that aren't disgusting or offensive. So, getting back to that, I need to explain what this kind of censor is that we're about to hear about to avoid confusion. But this is CENSER, and it's a device for holding burning incense, and you hold it in your hand, and it emits the smoke as you carry it around. And I'm sure you can all suddenly picture it in your head. You've probably seen some Eastern Orthodox priest carrying one down the long aisle of some cathedral somewhere. Bearing that in mind, let's check in to see what's going on in God's throne room at the moment.
When the Lamb broke the 7th seal, the heavens were silent for half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stood before God. They were given 7 trumpets. Another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a censer made of gold. He had been given a lot of incense to add to the prayers of all the holy ones on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense rose up, along with the prayers of the holy ones, from the angel's hand, in the sight of God.
Okay, so one thing I want to mention here is that trumpets were signaling devices. When we see people pulling out trumpets now, we start to think, oh, is this band camp? Or are they in some sort of ensemble orchestra that I'm not aware of? But when ancient people saw them, they immediately thought of political ceremonies or battles. So an ancient person seeing these paramilitary functionaries, i.e. angels, being handed trumpets is like a call to battle. We're seeing a nation-state going to DEFCON 0. As far as the angels being given 7 trumpets, I think it's interesting because it's almost like there's a trumpet for each signal. And remember, 7 is the number of divine perfection. When John says that there are 7 of something, we can almost replace that with a divinely perfect number of, or exactly as many as is best. I find this passage a little bit strange. Given its placement, it seems to be a kind of calm before the storm. Here is a very calm, restful image of the prayers of righteous people rising up before the throne of God. Doesn't make a lot of literal sense, but it does show God's connection to prayer. And before we move on, let's check in with the King James crew and see what they came up with. Let's make sure I'm not going off the rails or making stuff up here. Let's listen.
And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar, which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, which came with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God, out of the angel's hand.
So, as usual, the King James crew did a lot of work to clean up and formalize the tone and the syntax, and to sort of make it sound like the rest of the Bible. A good example is where I went ahead and used the crude and blunt phrase a lot of incense, because there really is no other way to render it without feeling like you're adding information or making it more formal than it is. So the King James had to go with much incense, and of course that sounds prettier. Also, the connection between incense and prayers is interesting. The smoke that rose up from the burning of sacrificial meat was described as being pleasing to God. And so this idea that smoke, being lighter than air, continually rises up into the sky made it poetically connected to prayers, someone's fervent wishes being directed to the heavens. And so we have a very deliberately serene image here. And as I mentioned before, it is a calm before the storm. The angels being handed those trumpets should have warned us that this peaceful, prayerful image was not going to last. This censer is Chekhov's censer.
The angel filled the censer with fire from the altar. Then he threw the censer to the earth, causing thunder and rumbling and lightning and earthquakes. The 7 angels prepared to blow their 7 trumpets. When the first trumpet sounded, hail and fire mixed with blood was thrown down to the earth, and 1/3 of the earth was burned. 1/3 of the trees were burned away, and all the green grass was burned away.
Well, all chill has been lost at this point. I think it's interesting that John gives us the image of the hot coals being placed inside the censer. And then when the censer is thrown down, we switch to this image of burning objects falling out of the sky. And I use the phrase thrown down to earth because that is precisely what John says. He says that the hail and fire mixed with blood was ebalen eis tengein. Ebalen, that's the aorist past of balein, which would be transliterated B-A-L-L-E-I-N. That B-A-L-L is important because that shows you that this is the Greek word that we get words like ballistic from. A ballistic trajectory means that it has the trajectory of being thrown, meaning it doesn't have its own power. Some force took it and accelerated it, and then let it go. Then physics takes over and maps out the rest of the path. And that's what has happened here. John is implying that these things have been directed toward the earth. I did mention this passage a little bit prematurely last week. I was talking about hail and fire mixed with blood before it was first mentioned. You can see from this little error that I suspect that John may be circling back to the same asteroid impact that we talked about in Volume 4. And so it's easy to get all these little events mixed up in your head because a lot of them overlap and they might be talking about the same thing. And John says that a third of the earth was burned, a third of the trees were burned away, and all the green grass was burned away. Well, the Greek word he uses here is katekai, which means consumed in flame, or burned to a crisp, or reduced to ash. So that's pretty thorough. Now, I hate to be this guy, but I gotta bring it up. John says here that all the green grass was burned away. What Greek words did he use to say green grass? And all the green grass. Kai pas hortos chloros. Oh boy, that sounds familiar. So yes, he's talking about pale green grass, or just green grass. Like I said, that word gets translated as just green a lot. So here we have the exact same book of the Bible, not even that far afterward. And notice that John is not telling us that all the pale grass was burned away. So I think that makes it pretty clear what color he wanted us to think that horse was that Death was riding. Okay, so that was the first trumpet. That was pretty bad. The second angel is about to blow the second trumpet. Let's see what happens next. Is it going to be something good or something not so good? Let's see.
When the second angel blew his trumpet, something like a huge mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the creatures in the sea, those that had spirits, died. And a third of all the ships were destroyed.
Okay, so definitely not good. Here we have another impact event. And if we're going to say, well, is this also the same one as the impact that we saw at the end of the last volume, which may have been the same one as what we just talked about a few minutes ago? At this point, it's starting to seem like we're talking about more than one impact. Especially because the impacts are discussed as having slightly different effects or even impact locations. And so maybe all these impacts happened at the same time, but we're just talking about the different effects that this rain of debris had on the earth. Now, the sea turning into blood, I'm thinking that is metaphorical, but we're supposed to think about the sea having a red or polluted quality. And I was thinking that an impact in the ocean that punctures the Earth's crust would create millions of tons of debris and primarily just elemental iron and some nickel that is pulverized, liquefied, and blasted into the air and the ocean. Well, I'm pretty sure that would be oxidized material. And oxidized iron, as we all know, looks a little red. And if there's a lot of that dust in the ocean, it's going to make the ocean water look red. Remember that rust is the reason why Mars is red. The red planet really just means the rusty planet. And that also, by the way, gives rise to some of the wild hypotheses that Mars was the result of some kind of global catastrophe, because it seems to have had a milder climate with liquid water, and now we have a planet that is devoid of moisture on its surface and covered in iron oxide, as if the planet was heated as a whole a long time ago. Now, all this heat and debris and the toxic gases that would dissolve in the ocean after being released from the mantle would kill a lot of ocean life, along with just the shock wave. As you can imagine, anything living in the water, even within miles of the impact location, would be killed because water is not compressible. And so shock waves in water are much more powerful and persist over a longer distance than shock waves through the air. Now, this thing about which creatures died and only those that had spirits died is interesting. Note that the Greek word that he uses for spirits is psychas, and psyche should sound familiar. You've heard this word all the time. Psyche, right? So no need to go on. I'm sure you guys knew what word I was talking about. That would be transliterated Psyche. Now, we see that and we say psyche, but no, it's psyche. And so any living thing that had a psyche, a psyche, a mind or a spirit, was killed. And so that means that the creatures that did not have spirits or souls or minds, they were okay. Does he mean that, say, the algae and the seaweed was okay? John may be carving out an exception for some class of beings that were thought to live in the oceans that don't have spirits. The monsters of the deep? Is he just being careful? Since people back then knew that the oceans had barely been explored, especially what we would call the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean now. Real quick, let's check back with the King James crew to see what they made of all this stuff about blood and psychas. Let's see.
The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed.
Okay, well, that didn't give us anything new. Just some fancy old language. But one thing I want to note again before we move on is that not everything dies. Not only does not all the life in the ocean die, but only 1/3 of the ships built by humans are destroyed. Now, I was a liberal arts major, so this is some pretty advanced math for me, but if I have a bunch of ships and 1/3 of them are destroyed, how many do I have left? Let's see. That would imply that, okay, looks like 2/3. So, 2/3 of the ships built by humans will survive this event, at least. So that's good. And hopefully there are no more impacts. Hopefully there's nothing else bad about to happen. Let's see what happens next. Surely we're not going to get another celestial event. Surely nothing else bad is going to fall out of the sky. But let's see.
When the third angel blew his trumpet, a huge star fell down from the heavens, burning like a beacon. It fell down on 1/3 of the rivers and into the natural springs. The name of the star is called bitterness. 1/3 of the water became bitter, and many people died because the water had become undrinkable.
Oh boy, I spoke too soon. So here we have another celestial event, and this one seems to be a little bit different. Instead of a burning mountain, this time it's a star. And it says burning like a lamp. Now that's kind of weird because of a discrepancy between modern and ancient technology. He straight up calls it a star, a huge star. Aster megas. We know what megas means. Aster would be Aster, which is where we get astronomy from, astronaut, all that stuff. And so it's a star. Now, it's a star that is kaiomenos, which means burning. It's the same word for burning that he used earlier to describe the burning of the grass and the trees. So this is something that is on fire, turning to ash. Now, it's kaiomenos in a particular way, though. It is kaiomenos hos lampas. Now, a lampe should sound familiar because that's where we get our English word lamp from. So it's burning like a lamp. That sounds weird to us because our lamps and lights don't burn. They use electricity of some kind. So some translations go with beacon or torch because those are good words for artificial lights that are used for signaling, but they are also burning. And so before we move on to start talking about the fact that this weird star has a name, and before we start talking about non-potable water sources, let's check in with the King James crew, see if they came up with something different.
The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers, and on the springs of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter.
Okay, let's start with the name of the star. Here's another instance where John just knows something, some fact, as though it were just pressed into his mind. Kind of like the name of the rider of the green horse. Now we know somehow the name of the star. And in Greek, it says that its name is ho absinthos. Now that ho is the Greek the. And so Greek adds the before words more often than English. Other European languages do that too. They'll add the where English doesn't. French does that a lot. Spanish will do it. And Greek will even do it before names. A lot of times in ancient Greek, when they're talking about, for example, Alexander the Great, they'll say the Alexander or the Alexander the Great One. The fact that he's adding a the here in front of it, I think underlines the fact that we're supposed to take this name as being descriptive or metaphorical in general. That it's not just some weird pet name that was attached to it. The name has meaning. And what is the meaning of absinthos? Well, absinthos refers to a plant. And it's a plant that has a very bitter taste, but also some medicinal qualities. If you process the root of this particular plant, Artemisia absinthium, you get this dark green oil that, if you ingest it, it can make you very sick, but it also kills worms. It gets rid of intestinal parasites, or at least, supposedly, they thought it did. And so, this little bush, they called it wormwood, because if you took the roots of it and you processed them into this green oil, you could deworm people with that. You could kill parasites. So, this green, bitter oil was used in different medicines, and it was eventually used in an alcoholic beverage that was made green by adding absinthos to it, and they called it absinthe. And this wormwood, because it had been used in medicines for so long, had developed a lot of old wives' tales about its function, about its side effects. And it turns out that one study did show that if you ingested enough of this oil, of this substance, that it could be dangerous to your health or could cause hallucinations. However, in the modern beverage we call absinthe, there is so little of that material in there that you would die from the alcohol long before the wormwood had any effect. And so this star called wormwood or bitterness or absinthos fell to the earth, and it made all of the waters bitter, or it turned them into wormwood. I used the word undrinkable. Many people died because the water had become undrinkable. The King James says that many died of the waters because they were made bitter. Now, this is interesting because are they dying because they can't drink the water and they're dying of dehydration? Or are they drinking the water and then the water is poisoned and that's why they're dying? It's kind of unclear. It certainly seems to be a level above the water being difficult to drink because of its flavor. And so it's a bit of a mystery. One thing I need to mention is that this plant that we're talking about, wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, also called mugwort, M-U-G-W-O-R-T. Wort, that word is an old Germanic word for a little plant. So, in Ukrainian, the word for this plant is Chornobyl. Chornobyl, which we would pronounce Chernobyl, as in the town in Ukraine that experienced a nuclear power disaster in 1986. Some people at the time were very concerned because Chernobyl definitely poisoned water. That event caused radiation levels to rise and did definitely render some water sources absolutely undrinkable. And by extension, some areas were left uninhabitable. I just find that interesting. I don't think that there is a real connection there. It's probably just coincidence. However, if you recall from the last volume, although we know that coincidences occur and that we have to allow for that, I talked about how it's important to let yourself occasionally question coincidence. Sometimes.
When the fourth angel blew his trumpet, a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were damaged, so that a third of them went dark, and only a third of the day could be seen, and the same at night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying at the top of the sky, saying with a loud voice, "I feel sorry for the people who live on the earth, because there are 3 trumpets left among the angels that are about to sound."
Wow. Well, this is just kind of mean. It's taunting people. This entire trumpet is to sort of just announce the need for anxiety. It's just to say things are just now starting to get bad. I think it's fascinating to have this talking eagle flying at the top of the sky. That's a weird phrasing, but it's very strange construction in Greek. It's sort of like it is flying along the midday line, the highest point of the sky for the sun. And it's definitely an eagle, and this is going to be important in a minute, but Genos aetou petomenu. It was a flying eagle. Not only is this an eagle, but it's petomenos. It's flying. En mesuranемati. That mesos is the middle. We already talked about what uranos means. But en mesuremati would be in the midline of the sky, in the midpoint of the heavens. And it definitely says the eagle was speaking, legontos, phone megale, with a big loud voice. And it was saying, uai, uai, uai. meaning whoa, whoa, whoa. Tus katoi juntas, epites geis. This woe word is interesting because there's a version of it in, as far as I can tell, every Indo-European language, especially in antiquity. This uai, which would be transliterated O-U-A-I, uai. That's what this eagle is saying, because that's woe in Greek. In English, at least in archaic English, it's W-O-E, woe. Latin had a famous phrase that used their version of the word, and theirs is why, similar to the Greek one, but they spelled it V-A-E, V-A-E, why. Now, the Romans had a phrase, why victis, V-A-E, V-I-C-T-I-S. V-I-C-T should set off some alarms. This means woe to the conquered. Or basically, it sucks to be conquered. It sucks to be beaten. Terrible things happen to you when you are subjugated. Now, for the last time in this volume, let's check in with the King James crew, because I want to know how they are translating this Mezuranemati, and then what are they going to do with this eagle business? Let's hear.
And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And I beheld, and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels, which are yet to sound.
Excuse me? What was that? Did I hear an eagle? There was no eagle there, right? Did I hear that wrong? So it's just an angel flying. An angel, okay. Well, this is an old controversy, and this has to do with the fact that some manuscripts say it's an angel, and then some manuscripts say it's a flying eagle. And we're not entirely sure how that discrepancy formed. I think that this is a good place to leave things for now, until the next volume. We know that things are really starting to heat up, literally in some cases. Well, we have covered everything up through the end of chapter 8. In the next volume, we're going to start with chapter 9. And chapter 9 is where things start to get a little weird, as if things weren't weird already. But this is when the angels will start unlocking the abyss, and strange things will happen. And what do we make of this so far? It doesn't seem fair or helpful to take a human and give them these repetitive, conflicting, unclear, upsetting images, and then expect them to do something constructive as a result. And so this is what leads me to think that, once again, something strange did happen to John, because when you take away the strange event, his actions don't really make sense. Not even for a person suffering from mental illness. I think that John's prose, and when he's talking about subjects other than what the being showed him, he's very clear, very cogent, very capable of operating in our world. Because warnings about the future, I've noticed, generally are not helpful. And it seems to me that we live in a universe where there are beings that are more powerful than humans that know the future and can make huge changes to the future that we can't. And yet they sort of just give us confusing warnings about what we're supposed to do. And it's usually something like stop war, or fix climate change, or shut down all the nuclear power plants. It's something that no single human and not even a small group of humans could do. So why take an individual person in some remote location and sort of fill their brain with these images and ideas when it's just one guy on an island in the Aegean in the 1st century AD? Sure, he has some influence. There are people who will read whatever letters he sends out. But is that really the best way to go about warning mankind about a future that we're supposed to avoid? And that's the trick. Why give a coherent warning when the thing that's supposed to happen has to happen and can't be avoided? That's what I'm thinking. They're almost like these quote-unquote warnings are just sort of venting. It's just the frustration you see when some silly group of beings that maybe you've become fond of are about to drive their train off a cliff, and you're trying to stop them, but you know you really can't. But the strange thing is that when we think about these terrible events, if they were to happen, and the worst happens, and you die, or the people that are closest to you die, that's not new information. We all know that that's going to happen to us. And it could be a simple car accident on the highway on the way home from work, or it could be a giant star named bitterness that poisons the water. Either way, you can't avoid it. And so I'm thinking that becoming nervous or anxious about this kind of material, or thinking, oh gosh, there might be an asteroid out there with our name on it. Well, of course. We're not going to be here forever. So, I'd say it's best to use this material that shows us the uncertainty of life and how precarious everything is, how all of human civilization is balanced on a razor's edge. I think this material helps us remember how delicate and uncertain everything is. And that's something we should focus on every day. And so, until next time, when we revisit John in some future volumes and resume with the very bizarre Chapter 9, just remember, keep caring for the people you're supposed to care about and keep doing the things you're supposed to be doing. Keep fighting the good fight, as Paul would say. And I will talk to you next time.